Wendy Moore, you are an author and a freelance journalist. Since you are in England, of course, you write for newspapers such as The Guardian, The Times, Sunday Telegraph, and The Express, and you have written 5 books: The Knife Man, Wedlock, How to Create the Perfect Wife. I would like to know more about that. The Mesmerist, and your latest book, No Man's Land, in North America and in the UK is Endell Street, which is what the trailblazing woman who ran World War I's most remarkable military hospital. Wendy, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure to join you. Thank you for inviting me.
So Wendy, I always think that the messenger is as important as the message. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about yourself. I mean, you have been writing for these publications. You have written 5 books. Is this something that you always wanted to be? Always wanted to be a writer?
Well, I definitely always wanted to be a writer. So as a child, I loved books. I spent all my time reading books. I'd go to the library and get 4 books out every week. So I almost always knew that I would be a writer. I didn't come to a point where I thought I want to be a writer. It was just always there. That's what I would do. And I think I always wanted to write books, but I had a very, very long detour really before I got to that point. So when I was at school, I loved English, wanted to be a writer, but I realized there wasn't really an obvious career path to becoming a writer. So I ended up going to journalism college straight from school for 1 year to train as a journalist, because that seemed to be the only career path to writing. There didn't seem to be any other obvious way of making a living as a writer. So I've been a journalist for more than 40 years, and only fairly recently, about less than 20 years ago, I actually got to do what I really wanted to do, which was to write books.
Wow. I find it amazing that you always knew that you wanted to be a writer. And there are people in their 40s, me included, who still doesn't know what they want to do with their life. What do I want to be when I grow up? So I don't know, can you put us in that perspective of always knowing what you want? And I think my case is not absurd. It's your case that is a little bit strange, that a person right from the early years, they already know what they want to do for the rest of their life.
I suppose I'm lucky in a way, because I never had any doubts. I never wanted, I think I had a brief period when I wanted to be a doctor or a ballet dancer or a teacher, but words were always what made most sense to me. So I kind of remember the first time I learnt to read and saw words, and I think it's then that the world started to make sense to me. So I always wrote, like poems or short stories from as long as I can remember, and that's what I always wanted to do. So, but it took me a long time to get to the point of writing books. And when I did publish my first book, or started writing my first book, that's when I thought, yes, this is really what I want to do. So, really, being a journalist was a kind of way to doing that, I think.
And is there any reason why you are tilted towards medicine subjects?
That's just pure chance, because I started out on local newspapers as a crime reporter. So my first job was going to police stations and getting the crime reports, and I loved doing that. I was really excited to do that. But then my editor, when I moved to London, the editor switched me to doing medical stuff. And I was quite annoyed, because that was seen as being a sort of softer subject at the time. But I very quickly found that there was just so much in it. There were just so many stories, medical care, hospitals, the medical profession. So many different aspects. And I didn't stop writing about that from that point on. And then I came to medical history. So I started getting interested in the history of medicine, and I did a diploma in medical history. And, I just found all these incredible stories. that hadn't really been told before properly, and just really thought, well, yeah, this is what I want to do. I want to write books about these amazing stories and amazing people from the history of medicine.
Wow. Okay, so I mentioned briefly the titles of the books. Can you tell us one more time the title and what is it that they're about? You have a beautiful description of them in your website, but for the listeners who are too lazy to go and watch and see the website.
So do you mean all of the books from
Well,
all of the books?
you have the Knife Man, the Wedlock,
Yeah.
How to Create the Perfect Wife.
Yeah. Okay.
Nice
Well,
title.
yeah. Okay. Well, the first book really came out of my diploma in medical history. So I was really looking for a story to start with. And so The Knife Man is about John Hunter, who was an 18th century surgeon and anatomist, and a fascinating man because he was very mixed up with the body snatchers. And he was fanatical about collecting body parts and animal parts, and created an incredible museum. So I just, he'd been written about before, but what was interesting was he a hero or was he a villain? Because he was doing quite, unethical things. So for me, that was a way in. So that was my first book. And that kind of led on to the second book. The second book was also about, it was about a woman in the 18th century who had been a friend of John Hunter. And she was tricked into marriage by an Irish fortune hunter who then abused her terribly, led her a terrible life, but she managed to escape. So that was another story, better than fiction, really. The third book was about how to create the perfect wife, and that was also an 18th century true story about a man who couldn't find the woman of his dreams. So he took two little girls, two orphans from an orphanage, to train them, and he decided he would marry the one who did best. Obviously that didn't end very well. And then the last book before this one, The Mesmerist, is about a doctor who brought hypnotism to Britain in terms of medical care. So he realised the possible benefits, the potential of hypnotism for medicine. And then my last book came out last year. And that's Endell Street here and No Man's Land in America and Canada.
And how is it that you stumble upon this story?
Well, usually with the books, each of the stories I'm looking out for, a good story, reading lots, going to different places. This one, it was sheer luck again, really. I was in a library, so it's a quite famous library. It's the Wellcome Library in London for the history of medicine. It's a fantastic place. And they had a painting on the wall of an operating theatre. And in the operating theatre, there was a man on the table, but all of the doctors were female. And I just thought, it's a huge, beautiful picture, but also so unusual to see an operating theatre completely staffed by women. And so I discovered that this hospital was, this theatre was in a military hospital in London in the First World War. And the hospital was run and staffed by women. So it was kind of, I didn't know anything about it until that point. I thought it was quite an amazing story. And so I found out more about it and decided that that's what I wanted to write about next.
And those doctors are Louisa Garrett Anderson and Flora Murray. Can you tell us a little bit about them? And for our Canadian audience, you have another doctor, Evelyn Windsor. Also, if you can just paper the story with her journey as well.
Yes, okay. Well, Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson were both doctors. They had qualified in Britain, but at the time they qualified, women doctors were restrained from working in mainstream hospitals. So women doctors were confined to treating only women and children. And that was the case in Britain and in America and in Canada at the time. So they could work as doctors, but their work was very restricted. And they were very angry about it. They had joined the suffragette movement to campaign for the vote. They were also incidentally life partners. They lived together as a married couple, essentially. So Louisa and Flora had campaigned for the vote. But when the First World War broke out, the suffragettes suspended their campaign to support the effort to fight the war. And so Louisa and Flora, they wanted to do their bit to volunteer to help in the war. But they also saw that the war gave women a big opportunity to show that they could do exactly the same work as male doctors, and that they could run a military hospital. So to begin with, Flora and Louisa ran a hospital in France for the Red Cross in France. So the British Army didn't want them. But because the army then went to look at this hospital in Paris and realised how successful it was, they then agreed that the second hospital they ran, which was near Boulogne in France, would be under the auspices of the army. And then at the beginning of 1915, the army asked them to run a major military hospital in the heart of London at Endell Street. And that hospital, so it was run as part of the army, but it was staffed, apart from about 20 men initially, and that later that was just 8 men, all the other staff were female. So all the doctors were women, nurses, stretcher bearers, orderlies, everybody, they were female. So it was unique, completely unprecedented, and was highly successful.
Wow. Let me ask you, so you say that they were life partners. In other words, they were lesbians. And I thought that at one moment in history, it was illegal in Britain to be gay. And I wonder if they got any pushback by society or by the government itself, or was it something that they prefer not to look at?
Well, we can't be 100% certain that they were lesbians. They certainly, they lived together, they were devoted to each other, they had identical diamond rings, they lived as a married couple. So I'm, 99% confident they were lesbians. But homosexuality for men was illegal in Britain, but not for women. So for women, it was never made illegal, largely because it was assumed women weren't lesbians. So that was seen as, they were invisible more or less. So it was quite common for 2 single women to live together, and nobody thought anything of that. So I think most people didn't even think that they were any, romantically attached. And so nobody really questioned them at all. It was, they were just seen as being very close companions, really.
Well, okay, so I knew that it was illegal to be gay, but I didn't know that that applied exclusively to men and not to women. So that's that's
Yeah.
very interesting. Can you tell us about the reaction of some of the soldiers when they arrived to the hospital and they see that everyone is a woman? Yes, how did they feel? Were they terrified? Were they happy? Did they say, I went to heaven, or maybe I went to hell?
Well, I think to begin with, they were really shocked, really surprised. They didn't, it was so unusual. And one of the excuses for not allowing women to treat men was that people said men would not be comfortable being treated by women doctors, even though they were nurses. But they still said women, men didn't want to be treated by women doctors. But so the men who first arrived at Endell Street, some of them were really so surprised they actually thought they had been sent there to die, because that was the only explanation they could think of for arriving at a hospital where everybody was female. But very quickly they all accepted it. They were quite happy about that, and not only accepted it, but they were then saying, "Oh, this is the best hospital in London. It's the most popular hospital in London." And it became so well known. There were lots of newspaper articles about it because it was unusual, and it was often kind of held up as being part of the, great Blighty spirit. So it became so well known that some men even asked to go there when they were wounded on the front. So it was accepted, and at the same time as being it was, it was very successful as a professionally run, efficient hospital. It was also, they ran it quite differently to a male military hospital. So they went to great pains to make sure that it was colourful and comfortable and bright and cheerful, because Louisa Garrett Anderson said that she believed most of the men were more wounded in their minds than in their bodies. So she wanted to heal them mentally as well. So they thought of it as having a kind of woman's touch at the same time.
Wow. So as you may know, we men, we have huge ego, and when we see women trying to compete it against us, we're terrified. So I wonder what was the reaction of other doctors. Did they have a sense of competition, envy, or denial? How were they accepted among the community of doctors?
Um, well, the medical profession as a whole were certainly skeptical about women doctors, and particularly wanted to protect their living. So that was one of the main reasons that women doctors had been kept out of mainstream medical schools. Male doctors didn't want that competition. But individually, there were lots of male doctors who had been supporting the suffragettes, and also did support women in the war working as doctors. So they did have lots of friends, individual friends, who were doctors, who did support them. And similarly in the army, initially in the army, the doctors and the medical chiefs were very hostile to the women trying to run a hospital. But then when they saw what they were doing, most of them also were converted, and then accepted the women for what they were doing. So yeah, so they were very much accepted. During the war, after the war, things changed again, and they were told to go back to doing their old jobs.
So how do they take that? I mean, they are there, I mean, smearing blood, saving life, and transforming society for 4 years. And then after the war, they are being told, thank you, we don't need you anymore. How, first of all, how was that acceptable? I mean, society itself was able to see the value of these female doctors. And how is it that, yeah, what was their reaction?
Yeah, well, there were thousands of women who volunteered in the war in different ways. So women doctors, not just at Endell Street, but women doctors worked in France and Egypt and Malta, as they were more accepted. And women obviously were working in factories and on public transport and on farms. So thousands of women had, given their efforts to the war. And really, as a kind of recognition of that, the government gave women the vote in 1918, at least to women over 30. So all men over 21 had the vote in 1918, and all women over 30. So there was some recognition, but I think they thought, okay, that's it now, go back to doing what you were doing. And well, in some ways, it's understandable, because men coming back from the war wanted their jobs back. Male doctors coming back from the army, they wanted to have their jobs back. So that's understandable. But obviously the women themselves were very angry, a lot of them, especially the women doctors, because they had proved that they were equal to the men. So previously it had been said women doctors could not be as good as men, but they had proved they could do that. Especially in surgery, which women doctors had little experience of before, but they had been as good at military surgery as the men. But so they were very angry about that. But most of them, they had to just go back to treating women and children, or retire, or work abroad. So it was many more years before they did ever get equal opportunity in medicine.
Okay, so many more years before they get equal opportunity in medicine. I know it's outside the scope of the book, but can you just quickly tell us about that evolution? Because right now, I think it's about equal. I mean, there is equal opportunity. I don't know if there is equal outcome, but how did it evolve throughout the years from World War I to our days?
Well, it's taken a long time, and I don't think we're quite there yet. So in the Second World War, again, women doctors worked in the army. So they did have equal pay then for the first time. But it took until really the 1970s till the Sex Discrimination Act in Britain, 1976, before women were legally given the same rights as men. And so that's when, for the first time, medical schools and hospitals had to treat women equally who wanted jobs in medicine. But then it took quite a long time before women gained equality. So now in Britain, 48% of the medical profession is female. So it's almost entirely equal, but women are still underrepresented in certain areas of medicine. So the higher paid, higher status areas, surgery in particular, consultants, the top level of the top ranking. So there is still quite a long way to go in medicine, but as in other fields where women are also underrepresented.
Is this underrepresentation now because of actual lack of opportunity, or just because, I don't know, higher, bigger demand on working hours, or lack of balance between home and profession?
Yeah, I think it's a whole range of those things. Yeah, I think it's partly still some prejudice that's happening. It's partly that the jobs in healthcare are made so that it's very difficult for women always to compete at the same level as men if they take breaks to have children. There's discrimination and there's prejudice. But yes, I think there's a lot of anger still among women doctors who still aren't being treated equally.
Wow, this is an amazing subject. Can you tell us one more time the title of the book and where they can buy it and where they can follow you, the messenger?
Yeah, sure. So the book is called No Man's Land. It's called Endell Street in the UK. I've got a website, so it's www.wendymore.org.
Oh, I just one more question. I just noticed here. At the beginning of the book, you talk about the short skirts that they were wearing, the doctors. Can you describe how short they were, the skirts?
Oh, okay. Well, they were daringly short for the time. So the women, when they went off initially to France and then later on, they devised their own uniform. So they had short skirts, but they were just above the ankles, in fact.
Oh
So
my God!
still,
They were
oh,
showing
still.
their ankles.
Well, yes, that was quite shocking at the
No
time.
wonder why the men couldn't concentrate.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Wendy,
And
thank you.
I didn't get a chance as well to mention the Canadian doctor.
Yes, please
Uh,
tell us the one word about her,
yeah. So in
Evelyn
fact,
Windsor.
yeah, because Endell Street became known throughout the world. It became famous throughout the world. So women from different parts of the globe went to work there. So 4 doctors from Australia came to Endell Street to work, and 1 doctor from Canada. So she was Evelyn Windsor. She'd qualified in Canada, but because of the same obstacles in Canada, she couldn't work in mainstream hospitals, and she'd had to work treating women and children. And when the war broke out, she decided to join the Canadian Army Medical Corps, but they, like Britain, they refused to accept women as doctors. So she joined as a nurse, even though she was qualified as a doctor, and came to London. And when they realised she was a doctor, then they allowed her to transfer to work at Endell Street. So she worked there. She was the anaesthetist for quite a long time. And while she was working at Endell Street, she actually got married. It was a kind of very quick marriage. She just arrived at the hospital one day and said, "I'm getting married today." So they came and joined her. And about a year later, she was pregnant, and she was still working as an anaesthetist while she was pregnant. So she only stopped working when she became, she was actually ill and couldn't work. But she came back to Canada, and unfortunately, she faced exactly the same prejudice after the war. So she wasn't again allowed to use her skills to work in mainstream hospitals. She worked for a native Canadian reservation, the Siksika tribe on the reservation for 20 years. But she was so they got to respect her so much that they made her an honorary member of the tribe. So.
Well, what an amazing lens into our history, and it makes me sad and mad that we waste so much talent and their
Yeah.
life. They want to give that talent to
Mhm.
humanity. Humanity say no, thank you. So that
Mhm.
makes me very
Yeah.
sad. But then again, you wouldn't have a story to share with us. So
Mhm.
once again, Wendy, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure.